we don't have to judge a church by how many people come into the church. It is better to judge the church by how many people they send out of the church. Because the purpose of the church is to evangelize the world. And the greatest way to evangelize the world is to do it by raising up other churches. Many have said, well, you need to have a lot of training. Yes, you do. So I understand the need for education. But I cannot put education above the leadings of the Holy Spirit. The position that says, if I'm not the head leader, then I can't lead. You will be tomorrow what you are preparing for today. It's a lie that says my position is holding me back. You don't need a title to lead, so don't wait for one.
All of us are leaders, every one of us. Someone is watching you, and their life is following in your footsteps. And when we come into difficulties, we need to drink the cup and be the leader that God has called us to be, whether it is just this position on the job site or in the family or in a church. It doesn't matter. We need to be willing to drink the cup.
This is Session 1 of Fighting the Good Fight, a seminar on managing church conflict by Reverend Chris Ball. This session is titled Causes of Conflict.
In this session, I want to talk to you how a pastor manages conflict. In pastoral care, you're going to find there's plenty of conflict to manage. And so it's very crucial that we understand what it means to manage conflict resolution. Let me give you some definitions that I have for conflict. Conflict is a situation in which two or more human beings desire goals which they perceive as being attainable by one or the other, but not by both. Because if they were by both, there would be no conflict. But one person over the other feels like they can accomplish the goal, and it creates conflict because they're not working together. Conflict occurs anytime there's a disturbance in the equilibrium and security of a protective environment. In other words, a lot of conflict happens over environment in the areas of ministry. It's like somebody is infringing on your particular ministry. I'll talk about that. Conflict arises when the actions of one party threatens the values, goals, and behaviors of another party. Let me say that one again. Conflict arises when the actions of one person threatens the goals and the values and the behaviors of another party. And then finally, conflict is two or more persons trying to have their own way regarding an important decision. Now, doesn't it sound like to you that those are the kinds of conflicts that you might have when working with people? Conflict began a long time ago with man's disobedience. There was no conflict in the very early creation of man. In fact, Adam and Eve, I believe, before the fall, had no conflict. It was the invitation to knowledge and invitation to be like God that actually caused conflict. And it happened in the fall, recorded in Genesis chapter 3. Jesus, however, experienced a lot of conflict in his ministry. In fact, if you study the Bible very well, you'll find that Jesus not only experienced conflict, he often initiated conflict. Let me give you some examples. In Matthew 21, 12 through 16, Jesus initiated the cleansing of the temple. He walked in and he didn't like the way the money changers were handling the atmosphere, and they were actually abusing people in the area of finances. they were tricking people, and he went in and he cleansed the temple. He said, this is a house of prayer. So Jesus even initiated conflict in that case. Imagine him confronting Pharisees. He would often confront Pharisees. He would say to the Pharisees, how come you believe such and such? You know, as a pastor, there are going to be times when you have to confront people lovingly, caringly, and it's going to create conflict. Because what will happen is you're trying to help a person become more like Christ, and your responsibility is sometimes to bring a confrontation to an individual. Maybe the person is not speaking in proper language. Maybe they every now and then have some vulgarity in their language. And you as a pastor would say, brother, I know that you love Jesus, but every now and then you speak in ways that I think are a violation of God's character. Just that suggestion that he needs to change or she needs to change as you're providing pastoral care to that individual, just that challenge can create conflict. Jesus had no problem, though, confronting the Pharisees and other believers about conflict and things that they needed to change. He even corrected the disciples very often. Very often the disciples would come and they would say, okay, we're doing this and that. And he would say, this is not the way to behave. In fact, many times he would challenge them in the weakness of their faith. He would say, oh, you guys, I can't believe you don't have faith. And of course, when you start challenging people in the areas of maybe their lack of faith or the areas of doubt, sometimes people are hurt. And out of that, you will have conflict. Now, here's what I believe, though. This is what happens a lot of times in ministry, is that Satan exploits the situation and the individuals in times of conflict. In other words, Jesus didn't seem to avoid conflict, but when conflict came about, I think, and even in our day, when we confront a leader or maybe we confront a situation, what I think happens a lot of times is Satan will piggyback on that conversation and make people feel like they're not worth anything, make people get angry. He pushes buttons in their lives. When the original person, you as a pastor, never intended to bring an offense, but the enemy of our souls who wants to destroy and kill us comes into situations like that and causes conflict to be exploited. When conflict itself isn't really a problem. I believe God permits conflict in our churches, in our relationships with people, whether it's our marriages, whether it's our relationships with staff, whether it's our relationships with people who are volunteering in the church. I believe God permits conflict to help us all grow, because conflict tells us sometimes that we need to make changes. So God permits conflict and help us to grow. I want to ask you this question. What are the 4 underlying causes of conflict? Let me suggest to you that there are at least 4. Number 1 is there's territory is threatened. Conflict happens when territory is threatened. What do I mean by territory is threatened? It's when 2 people want either the same space or 2 or more people want to have different goals. This happens all the time in churches. You'll have a youth worker and a children's church worker saying that they want a particular room for a particular Christmas event, or maybe they want to have a celebration or teaching in a particular part of the church, and they're fighting over territory. That causes conflict. How come you always give the youth pastor the bigger room? I want the bigger room. We have more children now. And again, this causes problems. Sometimes individuals in meetings have different ideas and different goals. And in the midst of those meetings, you make a decision as a pastor. You're saying, I think that this is the best decision to go. An offense can be caused in that moment, all because it's a different idea about how we would handle a territory, whether that be space or different goals. Now, when people are threatened in the area of goals and territory, there's 4 different ways that people tend to react when there's this kind of a conflict. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you're a teacher and you want to have a particular Sunday where you're going to show your children in front of the congregation all the Bible verses they've learned. So you're going to have a program, and it's going to be on a particular Sunday, and all of a sudden you find out that you can't do that because we have a special guest, and you're offended. So that creates conflict. So here's ways that people react to that kind of conflict. Number one, they withdraw. They say, I don't want to talk to you anymore. They act like somewhat childish, actually, when they're threatened in those areas of conflict. So their first reaction is, I'm going to withdraw. I'm not going to stay in the game. Another thing they do is they share the issue with everyone. They run around talking to everybody about what's going on. They don't deal with the right people in this area. They say, well, if Pastor really cared about our children's ministry, he would have let us have that spot on the Sunday morning. And they share with everyone. Sometimes what happens is people say, well, how about if I trade up? And they come to you as a pastor and they say, Pastor, how about if we trade something here? How about you give me the first Sunday then, in light of the fact that you took the Sunday I wanted? So their mindset is to try to negotiate. Sometimes what happens is people, instead of withdrawing or sharing with others and trading, they take everything they can get. They say, okay, I want every Sunday in January instead. Their attitude is reactionary. But the best thing, I believe, is people need to say, why don't we redefine our goals here? Why don't we define our objective as a ministry? And so that allows for the conflict to be subdued. Instead of withdrawing and sharing with everybody and maybe trading or having an attitude, I'm going to take my ball and leave, they say, why don't we redefine our goals so that we can be on the same page? So that's the first cause of conflict, is when territory is threatened. Another serious cause of conflict, and by the way, these can all be actually applied to your own marriages, some of these conflicts. Let me challenge you of the second one, when expectations are not fulfilled. Everyone knows in marriage that you come into a marriage and all of a sudden we have expectations that are not fulfilled. Well, that happens in churches. There's times when you come into a church and maybe you as a pastor are expecting your congregation to respond certain ways. Maybe you have staff in your congregation. You have maybe a Sunday school teacher here and a Sunday school teacher here who come together and they expect certain things. And when expectations are not fulfilled, it creates conflict. Let me give you 3 reasons why expectations cause conflict. Number one, expectations are not realistic or they're not clarified. Sometimes we have expectations of other people and they're really just not real. There's just no way that they can have it. This happens a lot with pastors when it comes to the area of how much do you pay a pastor. Sometimes a pastor is looking for a really high salary, and what will happen is the board says, well, we really aren't able to do that. And the pastor has now conflict because his expectation wasn't realistic. He was expecting a lot different salary than what was proposed by the board. But again, these are very real. Sometimes the expectations aren't clarified. Maybe you as a pastor have an expectation of what your salary should be, but then by the time you are in there, you haven't even clarified your need. And so therefore your expectation wasn't introduced to the board that's making the decision. Again, expectations are not realistic or clarified. The second reason expectations cause conflict is one person doesn't live up to expectations. In other words, they have been clarified. You've said to the board, I really would like to have this much money. They agreed to it, and then in your very next paycheck, you don't have the money that you expected. So the expectation wasn't lived up to. That causes conflict. Then, number 3, people and circumstances change, and this can cause conflict. In other words, we're just human beings. And while we might start out excited about a particular ministry, things change and people change. And as a result of changes, expectations change. And because expectations are not fulfilled, conflict occurs. So, for example, I've had a lot of people over the years who they started out in the ministry with these goals of being able to reach many people for Christ. They got a lot of energy in the beginning, but as time went on, their energy decreased and expectations were not fulfilled. That causes conflict. Number 3, the third reason that we have conflicts, number 1 being that territory is threatened, number 2 that expectations are not fulfilled, is number 3, leadership and administrations are faulty. let me explain that a little bit to you. There's all types of leadership that are not that they don't make sense to us. They don't fulfill what they say they're doing. They're faulty at some level or another. Let me clarify that a little bit more for you. For example, sometimes in leadership roles, the role is not clearly defined. This happens a lot with a board of elders and a pastor. Sometimes the question is, okay, do the elders have this responsibility and the pastor have this responsibility? Sometimes they're completely different and they haven't been clarified. So then there's a faultiness. There's a fraction between the relationship of the pastor and his elders because they haven't been defined. Many times a pastor will go to the church and he's expecting the elders to do the work of the ministry, be involved in the ministry, and the elders might be thinking, no, we don't want to do the work. We just want to make decisions for other people to do the work in ministry. That happens all the time where the roles are not clearly defined. Sometimes the question is, who is really my boss? A lot of times, especially in small rural churches, you'll find that you'll have a pastor and he goes to the church and he has like 5 or 6 bosses. In fact, sometimes there are some churches where they think everyone is the pastor's boss. These roles need to be defined. Who is really in charge? Who is the boss in the church? Is it the pastor? Is it the elders? If it is the elders, what roles do they play in the area of leadership over that particular pastor? Again, I realize that your denomination or the group of ministries that you're a part of might have different paradigms when it comes to these illustrations I'm giving you. But the truth of the matter is conflict happens because of the leadership not being clear in its understanding. Sometimes there's just a breakdown in communication with leaders. Again, staying on the same idea here that you have elders and pastors sometimes working together. Sometimes there's just a breakdown in communication. You either haven't communicated or your communication has been not clear. That's happened to me over time. I thought one time I was planning a big event. I had a great big event planned, and I thought my elders were with me. I thought they were on board. I thought they loved it. I had done all the work. And then when the day came for the event to happen, none of the elders showed up at the event. I've never been more surprised in my life. I thought they were going to show up. But you know what? I had never communicated to them that I wanted them to show up. It was an absolute painful experience, and conflict happened because I was very hurt, very frustrated, and I had to talk to the elders. But they all said to me, and they brought it to my attention, never did you ask us if we were going to come, and never did you tell us that you wanted us to come. See, I expected it, but there was not clear communication. Sometimes the faulty in leadership is just poor planning. If you have poor planning, conflict can happen. I know a friend of mine who's a pastor, and I love this guy, but one of the things, he didn't plan very well. And so I'll give you an example where conflict happened all the time. Because he wasn't a good administrator and he wasn't a good planner and didn't keep a calendar, very often he would say to people, hey, listen, if you want to meet with me, why don't we meet at the church at 7 p.m. tonight? Everybody would show up except him because he was a poor planner. Everybody was mad. And then they even got more mad when they found out that he was fishing, that he wasn't even doing anything. And it all happened because of poor planning. Sometimes there's leadership issues because of this issue. Leaderships are too autocratic. What do I mean by autocratic? They make all the decisions and don't listen to anybody else. They lead the team in such a way where they're autocratic, and they just are the director of everything. They make all decisions on the basis of their own conclusions. You see, the problem with that is this. If you have a church that is open to letting the pastor make all the decisions, then you have no problem. But if you have a church where the pastor comes into that church and they're used to having a team effort to making decisions, you'll have conflict. More often than not, pastors who are autocratic have a trail of damage behind them just because they don't give people an opportunity to share their heart. It's very, very important. I found more often than not, people are not so mad that you didn't choose something they wanted you to choose or make a decision regarding what they wanted to do. They're more mad or upset or, if you will, in conflict with you because you never gave them an opportunity to share their opinion. It is so crucial, but this, again, is another underlying cause of conflict. Leadership is political, is another one. Leadership is political. You need to be very, very careful of politics in the church. I know it happens, politics in the church. Let me give you a word that will help you rather than saying politics, is when a leader shows favoritism. He always asks the same people to do the same thing. He always makes his decisions around, a favoritism towards individuals. Family gets priority versus somebody who's been there forever. These are all situations and problems. Another problem with leadership that causes conflict is the whole area that leadership is too weak. It's one thing to have an autocratic leader, but then the other side of that coin is you can have a leader that doesn't make any decisions. They're unable to make decisions. I've known situations in churches where the whole congregation is waiting for the pastor to say, let's take that mountain. Let's go after that initiative. And he doesn't make the decision. Why? Because he's afraid of conflict. He's afraid of a few people over here that are going to get upset if we go out and buy a new endeavor or spend our money in a particular way. He's too weak to make decisions. So you have the guy on one side of the coin who actually is saying, hey, this is, I'm going to make all the decisions. And then on the other side of the coin, you have a leader who's not able to make decisions. Please listen to me. Both of them create conflict in leadership areas. The fourth area is attitudes with personalities. The attitudes of personalities and clashing. Again, I'm talking about 4 underlying causes of conflict. Number 1 is territory is threatened. 2, expectations are not fulfilled. 3, leadership and administrations are faulty. And number 4, attitudes and personalities clash. We all have prejudices and biases. Both are causes of conflict. Everybody has a certain set of thinking. You come into ministry with a certain set of biases, the way you think, the way you understand Scripture, the way you understand leadership. And when you come into ministry with these different biases, a lot of times you'll come into conflict with other people. It's called a chemistry clash. I know in my church I've had this experience many times. I'm a person who really believes in grace and truth. Jesus, it says of Jesus that he showed up full of grace and full of truth, both of them. Well, every now and then I have people in my church who have a bias towards truth. They feel like, Pastor Chris, you don't preach enough about truth in their mind. And there's a conflict in somewhat of a chemistry. Obviously, I preach on truth. Obviously, I believe in truth. But the thing is I'm not going to preach truth without the balance of grace. If you have a preaching towards truth, only truth, you'll have legalism. If you only preach towards grace without truth, you'll have what I call sloppy agape. It's love without any confidence, without any strength. And so it's like a grace that enables all kinds of behavior. Jesus came full of grace and full of truth. Well, often over the years, we'll have people that will come to our church, and they come into the church because they like our worship or they like a particular series I'm preaching. But then all of a sudden, because I'm not preaching that series all along, because they have a nugget of mindset, a bias towards a certain style of preaching, because I've changed in their mind, then it creates conflict. You'll have that experience as a pastor, I assure you. There's going to be times. And what I've done is I've taught people in these situations that really what's going on here is not that you're bad. It's not that you're wrong. It's just that there's a chemistry problem. Oil is good and water is good, but they don't mix. And sometimes there'll be people in your lives, they're good people, but they have a chemistry issue with you and they just don't mix. Please don't be so frustrated because everybody doesn't agree with you, because not everybody will agree with you. But conflict can happen out of the fact that there's chemistry differences, personality clashes. We all have different temperaments. And so we need to be very careful not to expect everybody to be just like us. You need to know that personalities clash and it causes conflict. You know, maybe you're a quiet guy and you're around a real loud person. Obviously, you're quiet, they're loud. You ought to know that sometimes can be conflicting. So that, again, another reason for conflict. Let me just review the 4 underlying causes of conflict. Number 1, territory is threatened. When that teacher wants that space, when the other teacher wants the same space. Then there's the expectations are not fulfilled for many reasons. You come into a particular ministry, a particular decision, and you have expectations and are not fulfilled. Conflict arises. And then administration and leadership is not flowing like it ought to, because it's not well defined, because you have autocratic or weak leadership. And then finally, there's that personality clash. You're a quiet introvert while you have somebody else who is strong and their personality is so different, and you kind of rub each other. So I really feel like in these 4 areas of conflict, if you just identify them, if you just begin to see what they are and begin to put them on the table in front of you, it will help in your conflict resolution. I think there are basically 2 main issues involved in conflict. Let me tell you them. Number 1, natural issues. And number 2, emotional issues. Let me talk about natural issues in conflict. What do I mean by that? Natural issues are things like your beliefs, your values, and your traditions. You know, I have had the privilege of traveling to other nations and not even realizing that the natural traditions of that particular, ministry or even that culture might actually become a conflict with my traditions. So the way we dress, for example, or the way we conduct ourselves when we stand in a church, the way we joke around. Sometimes what is funny in one culture is not funny in another culture. And sometimes just that natural way we were brought up, the natural tradition, can become an area of conflict. A lot of times it's just natural to have different goals. It's not wrong to have goals, but a lot of times your goals are different from the goals of other people. These are called natural areas of conflict. Sometimes programs and methods become conflict. In other words, you have a certain way that you want your youth group to be run. You would say, hey, the way I want my youth group to run is we don't want to have worship until the end of the service. We want to have worship at the beginning of the service. Well, you come in there and that particular church or that particular organization has been used to having worship at the beginning of the service. And you're saying, well, I want to do something different. You'll have conflict every time because of just a natural different belief of how you're going to run that worship or that youth group. And your goal might be to say, well, look, I want to get the word in you. I want to get the word in you before we sing. I want to make sure you're hearing the word, youth, and then we'll sing, because now the word's in you, we can rejoice because the word is in us. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you have a group of people that are naturally used to having worship before the word's preached, you're going to have conflict. Again, it's not wrong. It just is natural creation of problems in the area of conflict. So you have values, beliefs, traditions, purposes and goals, programs and methods, and then conflicts over facts. A lot of times you might know the facts, a certain order of facts, but then somebody else would say, well, here's the facts. And now you have 2 different sets of facts. I've seen this happen before in areas of budgeting in particular. How much is it going to cost us to hire somebody to be a gardener for the church? Because we didn't have a volunteer in this particular situation. So we need to have a gardener for the church. Well, we know how much it will cost. We've done our study. So we come back to the board and we say, I think it's going to be, $1,000. In our case, it would be dollars. $1,000 to hire this gardener for a year. And then somebody over here says, well, that's way too much. We can get it done for $500. So we talk about facts that are different. We've done our homework and we've tried to discover what will it really take to have a gardener, but we've come up with different facts. How many, I bet you understand it. When you start talking about that, now you're talking about money, all of a sudden, those different facts of how much it will cost could create conflict. Again, all sorts of conflict. You need to understand the reasons for these conflicts. Emotional issues are the second. So the first one was natural issues are the causes of conflict, but then the other one is emotional issues. Let me talk about emotional issues. The lack of acceptance or recognition or appreciation. This shows up all the time. Pastors, it is so important that you recognize, appreciate, and love and thank your congregation for service. I was in a church recently, and I met this woman who was an incredible Sunday school teacher. And I asked her, how long have you been teaching Sunday school? And she told me she had been in that church for 7 years, and she had taught the first grade children in their Sunday school. And I said, wonderful, you're amazing. It's just amazing the way you handle the children. And she said, I think that's the first time anybody's ever told me how good I am, and it showed appreciation to me. Wow. And you know what? That caused me to do a little bit of investigation. And I have done some studies, and I have found that very often we forget to say thank you enough. And that can hurt, and it creates conflict. This is an emotional conflict issue. When people feel unappreciated, uncared for, unaccepted, there's unfair treatment, real or imagined. Sometimes we feel mistreated, whether it's real or imagined, it's still an area of conflict. We feel like nobody cares. Nobody is treating us right. These are issues that cause us a great deal of concern. So what we need to do is recognize in all these underlying causes of conflict and so forth is as I've developed this teaching for you about as a pastor, the first thing to handling conflict is understanding where it comes from. And so my challenge to you is this. If you were just to take this teaching here and analyze what is really going on, it will be the first step towards repairing your conflict. So let me just briefly go over them again as I conclude my teaching in this session. Number one, ask the question, is territory threatened? Is territory threatened? Just identifying if the territory is threatened. What's going on with this couple? Why are they arguing? Why is this youth pastor and children's church director, why are they arguing? Is it territory threatened? Do they both want the same space? Do they both want the same ideas? It'll help you for solving your conflict. Number two, ask, is there a problem with expectations? Maybe the expectations weren't clear. Maybe the expectations weren't mentioned. But again, as you start to delve into the conflict, just identifying what is the reason behind this conflict. Does it have to do with unfulfilled expectations? Is it a leadership problem? Do we have somebody here that's just too weak to make the decision? Is there a problem where there's not a clear role definition? Maybe we thought that the elders had this responsibility, but they really don't in your mind, then a conversation needs to happen where roles are clarified. Who is really my boss is asked all the time in churches. Is it the elders that are in charge of the youth director and the children's church director, the volunteer staff, the ushers, or is the pastor the boss? Who is the boss? Sometimes there's faultiness in this leadership direction. And if you could just ask these kind of questions, you'll be well aware and well on your way to solving conflict. And then the last one, is this just an attitude or personality clash? Because you see, it may not be territory. Maybe it's not territory. Maybe it's not about goals and differences in goals. Maybe it's not about expectations. Maybe it's not about poor leadership. Maybe all you have is a personality clash. You have somebody who's an introvert or somebody that's an extrovert, and the two of them just do not work well together. And I'll be honest with you, sometimes that's all it is. And we need to be able to identify these things so that we can begin to manage conflict as we pastor the church. Let me assure you, conflict will help you grow. Do not allow the enemy of our souls to come in and exploit conflict. Don't let him come in and cause the conflict to go bigger than it needs to. We need to get right on conflict. We need to not let any time pass. I've given you some ways, some ideas of what are the root reasons, what are the causes of conflict. And just identifying these will help you as a pastor as you begin to analyze the conflict situation. Begin to ask questions. What is really the root problem here? Sometimes it's chemistry. Sometimes it's a leadership fault. Sometimes expectations are not filled. And sometimes it's just plain old territory is threatened. I want my way. I guarantee you'll have conflict, but conflict will help you grow as you manage it in your ministry. Thank you.